Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Welcome to Founder of the Day, where we will be discussing Federalist number 8. Now, if this is your first time coming to a Federalist read along, we are going to go line by line and try and decipher the 18th century language that are the Federalist Papers, or is Federalist number 8. And we are going to see what we can take from it, learn about what the founders were thinking when they created the United States Constitution, maybe reflect a bit on how it's still relevant today, though we do our best to keep objectivity and keep modern politics out of the discussion. With that being said, I'm not going to waste your time. Let's get right into it. I'm going to pull up the paper here. We are starting with the beginning. Federalist number 8. The title is The Consequences of Hostilities Between the States. The last discussion was about possible dissensions between the states, so Hamilton discussed why the states might get a little hostile with each other, and in this paper, as the title implies, he's going to discuss what will happen if there are hostilities that emerge between the states. This, I will note, is for the New York packet. He had been writing for the Intelligencer. They do end up publishing them in multiple different papers in New York State about at the same time. But it's interesting to note that they do change papers. And November 20th, this is 5 days after the previous Federalist. And again, it's being written by Alexander Hamilton. As always, he is starting to the people of the state of New York. These were, I like to remind everyone, propaganda pieces that were attempting to sway public opinion in favor of the Constitution. So, with that being said, let's get right into it. I'm going to adjust my chair just a bit here, a little further back. Oh, bump my table. All right. Now, again, we go one sentence at a time. Let me see. Oh, it's a big sentence, so we'll probably have to break it down, but let's go for it. Assuming it, therefore, as an established truth that the several states, in case of disunion, or such combinations of them as might happen to be formed out of the wreck of the general confederacy, would be subject to those vicissitudes of peace and war, of friendship and enmity with each other, which have fallen to the lot of all neighboring nations not united under one government. Let us enter into a concise detail of some of the consequences that would attend such a situation. So, real quick, we're going to break this down. He's assuming it's an established truth that in case of disunion or such combinations that might happen out of the wreckage of the Confederacy. Right off the bat, as we've discussed in the last two Federalist papers, Hamilton is really attacking this idea of disunion. The idea that the Confederacy, the Articles of Confederation, are just going to be gotten rid of and no government replace it. Again, no Anti-Federalists were calling for that. In a fashion, what Hamilton is doing is he's kind of slandering his opposition in a way to say it. Not slander necessarily, but he's accusing his opponents of something they really have never promoted, which is disunion, or such combinations as might happen. Oftentimes, both John Jay and Alexander Hamilton, up to this point, have discussed the idea of separate confederacies, like a Confederacy of New England, Confederacy of the Mid-Atlantic. Had the Articles of Confederation fallen apart, that might be it. But again, at this point, even the Anti-Federalists still wanted a union, and they still wanted to improve it. But of course, he falls to this, because that is the argument he's making, which, to be fair, he's starting from the very beginning. Even if no one is promoting this, the idea of disunion, he's dispelling no union right off the bat. Eventually, they'll get into why the Constitution or a national government is better than the Articles of Confederation, though John Jay already did use the phrase national government a few times. Would be the subject of those vicissitudes of peace and love. So again, he's assuming that if they break in part, then they'd have to decide if we'll go to war or be friends. If we'll be enemies or friends. Just as always happened throughout neighboring nations, by which he means literally nations that border each other, that are not under the same government. All right, big start, Hamilton. Let's see. War between the states in the first period of their separate existence would be accompanied with much greater distresses than it commonly is in those countries where regular military establishments have long obtained. So he's saying, if and when these states go their separate ways, when wars inevitably break out, as he had discussed in the last paper, it will be much harder on both nations because they're new and they have small militaries that are not necessarily well trained, not necessarily well funded, and have very little experience. Those nations are going to have a harder time fighting wars than long established nations. And let's see if I've cut him off here with that explanation. He might be saying just that. The disciplined armies always kept on foot on the continent of Europe, though they bear a malignant aspect to liberty and economy, have, notwithstanding, been productive of the signal advantage of rendering sudden conquests impractical, and of preventing that rapid desolation which is used to mark the progress of war prior to their introduction. So, basically, though the armies of Europe might not be great for freedom and might not be great for the nation's economies, they are good at making sure someone just doesn't invade out of nowhere for no random reason, because they are well-disciplined, trained armies that could withstand that kind of sudden attack. The art of fortification has contributed to the same ends. So, much like the armies are ready to fight at a moment's notice, the nations of Europe are fortified and ready for invasion. The nations of Europe are encircled with chains of fortified places which mutually obstruct invasion. So, same thing, they're ready. And interesting chains of fortified places which naturally obstruct invasion. So they both have forts kind of standing there looking at each other, intimidating each other from starting willy-nilly wars. Campaigns are wasted in reducing 2 or 3 frontier garrisons to gain admittance to an enemy's country. Campaigns are wasted in reducing 2 or 3... Right, so you could spend a whole war, not a whole war, a campaign is a piece of a war, but, a whole season of warfare. You could waste your time just trying to get through 2 or 3 forts, getting into the country to start the war. Again, he's giving us examples of Europe's current situation. I'm sure he will relate it to the United States. Similar impediments occur at every step to exhaust the strength and delay the progress of an invader. So, as he's saying, once you get past the forts, you have soldiers there slowing down anyone trying to start a war for useless reasons, I guess we can say. Formerly, an invading army would penetrate into the heart of a neighboring country almost as soon as intelligence of its approach could be received. But now a comparatively small force of disciplined troops acting on the defensive with the aid of posts is able to impede and finally to frustrate the enterprises of one much more considerable. So, again, speaking about Europe, an invading army would penetrate, and it used to be that you could just put together an army and go into your neighbor's country. Now, a fairly small amount of soldiers in Europe specifically, with the aid of the forts that are there, could really stop a large army from coming in pretty easily because they're trained, they're prepared, and they have backup. The history of war in that quarter of the globe is no longer a history of nations subdued and empires overturned, but of towns taken and retaken, of battles that decide nothing, of retreats more beneficial than victories, of much effort and little acquisition. So, it's no longer, once upon a time, Europe was big empires taking over great vast of land, or those empires being rejected by the people they're trying to invade. Now, at Hamilton's contemporary time, the warfare was basically, this town would be taken by one nation and then taken right back, and they just switch peripheral towns and forts instead of completely invading each other. Take a quick sip of water here. All right. In this country, the scene would be altogether reversed. So what we just said about Europe, just assume the opposite for the United States in the late 18th century. The jealousy of military establishments would postpone them as long as possible. The jealousy of military establishments would propose, I'm not sure what he means by them. I'm assuming he means wars, or maybe he means the establishment themselves, because people would be jealous of and angry at their neighbors' forts. Both sides would probably wait to put them up. Let's see if that's what he's saying. The want of fortification, leaving the frontiers of one state open to another would facilitate inroads. So because there's no forts, neighboring states could pretty easily just walk on in with their armies. Again, the point of this paper is to discuss what would happen should the states go their separate ways and wars erupt. So we are assuming, hi Jeremy, thank you for coming, hi Cookie, we are assuming that war has broken out between two states. The populous state would, with little difficulty, overrun their less populous neighbors. So pretty easy, there's no forts, these states are right next to each other, the one with more people can put together the bigger militia and just go take their neighbor. Pretty simple. Conquest would be as easy to be made as difficult to be retained. Okay, so as Hamilton said, you just storm right through, no big deal. But just as easy you could take it, it would be hard, just as easy to lose because, well, we'll see, probably because you're spread out and such. War, therefore, would be desultory and predatory. So, not entirely sure what the definition of desultory is, but we can go with predatory. Wars would be opportunistic. Okay, look, I can go and get my neighbor's stuff right now, and they just get it. And it looks like that's what he's saying. Again, these are his capital letters, not mine. Plunder and devastation ever march the train of irregulars. So, they'd go through, pillage it, basically. The calamities of individuals would make the principal figure in the events which would characterize our military exploits. Calamities of individuals would make the principal figure in the events which would characterize our military exploits. So what he's saying is individual people out on their own, not in cities, those are the calamities. Just people by themselves would just have their stuff taken by the neighboring states, and there's not much they'd be able to do to defend themselves. This picture is not too highly wrought, though I confess it would not long remain a just one. So you can tell that this is what's going to happen, but when he says just one, pretty soon it's going to go from, hey, we want this because we need it, to we're just doing it because we're Vikings, basically. Safety from external danger is the most powerful director of national conduct. That's a fun line. Safety from external danger is the most powerful director of national conduct. The best way to make decisions as a leader of a nation is to tell people you're protecting them from outside dangers. I mean, you could argue now, over the 20th century, we learned it's just as powerful to tell people you're protecting them from internal dangers, but the sentiment remains the same. Hey, New Jersey, New York's coming for you. We need to stand together and fight New York's invasion, essentially. Because again, this is the presumption that the states themselves are going to war. Even the ardent love of liberty will, after a time, give way to its dictates. Oof. So even people that are very attached to their freedom and are aware of their freedoms will eventually, if they're pressured enough from other nations threatening invasion, will give up their liberty for their own safety. Again, this is Hamilton's words, not mine. Don't come at me. The violent destruction of life and property incident to war, the continual effort and alarm attended on a state of continual danger, will compel nations the most attached to liberty to resort for repose and security to institutions which have a tendency to destroy their civil and political rights. That's a fun sentence too, Hamilton. Let's break this down. The violent destruct of life and property incident to war. So wars just kill people and destroy the things people own and the way they live. Additionally, the continual effort and alarm attendant on a state of continual danger. So the need to always be alert and ready for the fight if you are perpetually or always under attack from another nation will compel the most reposed security institutions, will make sure that nations and the people in a nation, even if they love freedom, eventually to secure themselves, they will have to band together and give up some of their own freedoms to make sure that they can mutually protect each other from outside invasion. As Hamilton says before, the real purpose of a government is to protect people from outside invasions, in his opinion. And it does have a tendency to destroy their civil and political rights. To be more safe, they at length become willing to run the risk of being less free. That is what happens. He's not saying this is a good thing. He's just saying from his understanding, that's what it is. Again, it's one of the reasons, and I'm sure he'll get more into this, one of the reasons he would prefer to unite so that the states don't go to war with each other and they don't fall into this situation. Okay, standing armies. Here we go. What fun. And I'm going to note right here that you often hear people reflecting that the American founders hated standing armies, and some of them did. And you're about to hear Alexander Hamilton discuss why he loves standing armies. So, as with people today, the American founders had disagreements about many things politically. Hamilton might not have liked how the British standing army was run, but to be fair, Hamilton probably did like how the British standing army was run of all the founders, but just because some people didn't doesn't mean they all didn't. The institutions chiefly alluded to are standing armies and the correspondent appendages of military establishments. So he's basically saying we're going to talk about standing armies now. I like how he says the corresponding appendages of military establishments. So basically any supply lines, anything associated with an army. That's just a fun way to say it. Standing armies, it is said, are not provided against in the new Constitution, and it is therefore inferred that they may exist under it. Now, this is a big acknowledgement from a writer of the Constitution. The Constitution does not say you can have a standing army, but what he's saying is the Constitution does not say you cannot have a standing army. And that's a double negative. So therefore, the Constitution, being silent on standing armies, implies that it's cool with standing armies. Now, you see this one here on my website. I forgot to mention, you can read along. There's a link in the description below. And there is a footnote. So we're actually going to go down real quick to the footnote. This is Hamilton's footnote, not mine. This objection will be fully examined in its proper place, and it will be shown that the only natural precaution which could have been taken on this subject has been taken, and a much better one than is to be found in any constitution that has been heretofore framed in America, most of which contain no guard at all on this subject. So what he's saying down here, yeah, me too, Galloway. What he's saying down here in the footnote is basically, we will discuss this later. So we go back up here. He's basically saying we're going to discuss this later. And even though a lot of people are afraid of standing armies, as I find it again, even though a lot of people are afraid of standing armies among his contemporaries, doesn't mean we've acknowledged that. And unlike other constitutions in the state governments, this constitution of the federal government is much better at how it handles standing armies, which is interesting because he says there's nothing discussing standing armies, but we'll get there in a later paper where he goes deeper into how the standing army of the United States actually operates. Here, he's just discussing why it will be helpful for the people. Their existence, however, from the very terms of the proposition, is, at most, problematical and uncertain. Okay, so, I'm sorry, I did two sentences there. So, there exist standing armies, from just the idea of them, are both problematic and uncertain. So he acknowledges that they're a little iffy. But standing armies, it may be replied, must inevitably result from a dissolution of the Confederacy. So again, he's falling back onto this old stomping ground that no one else is actually promoting, the dissolution of the Confederacy. The idea that, we should break up into 13 different nations. Although at the time, the states largely did view themselves as nations, they did want some kind of union. They did want a Confederacy. But Hamilton is still riding this train, saying that, well, if we were to break up in separate nations, standing armies are going to form. Your separate governments are going to make them happen anyway. So might as well get on board, because without us, even though at the time with the exception of, I believe, Rhode Island, none of the states had a real standing army. So, frequent war and constant apprehension, which require a state of as constant preparation, will infallibly produce them. So again, he's saying what he's been saying. If the states break down into separate nations, they're going to go to war for a variety of reasons because they're neighbors, and that's what happens. And if you're always at war, you're going to need to put together a standing army. The weaker states or confederacies would first have recourse to them to put themselves upon equality with their more potent neighbors. So the smaller states with less people, they'd be the first to create standing armies because it would be necessary to defend themselves. You know, Rhode Island would need an army to defend itself against Massachusetts. They would endeavor to supply the inferiority of population with the resources by a more regular and effective system of defense, by disciplined troops and by fortifications. So they need to protect themselves by using better defenses, which includes disciplined troops and fortifications. As I said earlier, like in Europe, you would need troops ready for invasion at any time and forts that are ready for invasion at any time. They would, at the same time, be necessitated to strengthen the executive arm of government, in doing which their constitutions would acquire a progressive direction towards monarchy. So the executive branch of all of the state governments at the time and most Western governments in the world, the goal of the executive branch is to enforce the laws, and part of that is running the armies. And to have a standing army at all times, you need to be ready to protect yourselves. You need a stronger executive, and therefore the governors of each state would be given more power, which would progress inevitably towards monarchy, which everyone was afraid of at the time, except really Hamilton was one of the few founders who was like, oh, so close to, I'm not going to get off on a tangent here, but Hamilton did allegedly, according to the notes we've received, stand on the floor of the Constitutional Convention and extol the virtues of the British monarchy for a whole day. That's why if you see the musical Hamilton, in the one song they say, he speaks for 6 hours, the convention is listless. And it's like, yeah, he was talking about how sweet monarchy was. Anyway, it is of the nature of war to increase the executive at the expense of the legislative authorities. So, like he was saying before, if you're always at war, you need to give more power to your executive branch, your president, your governor, and that will naturally, if you're moving power there, you have to take it from somewhere. It will usually come from the Congress or the legislative branch. Okay. Fun. The expedients which have been mentioned would soon give the states or confederacies that made use of them a superiority over their neighbors. So, building these standing armies would give you more power than your neighbor that doesn't have a standing army. Small states, or states of less natural strength, under vigorous governments and with the assistance of disciplined armies, have often triumphed over larger states, or states of greater natural strength which have been destitute of these advantages. So, sweet, if you have a small state with less people but a stronger army, you could beat, Rhode Island could beat Massachusetts. You know, Delaware could beat Pennsylvania. It's happened. Not with those particular examples, but in history. Neither the pride nor the safety of the more important states or confederacies would permit them long to submit to this mortifying and adventitious superiority. Not advantageous, adventitious. It's 18th century language. That's why we're doing this. So what he's saying here is, if Delaware invaded Pennsylvania successfully, Pennsylvania and any other strong, more populated state would not let this embarrassment stand for very long. Eventually, they turn around and make some revenging. Oops. They would quickly resort to means similar to those by which it had been effected, to reinstate themselves in their lost preeminence. So, to do that avenging, they themselves would create a standing army, as he's verifying for us. Thus, we should, in a little time, see established in every part of this country the same engines of despotism which have been the scourge of the old world. By the old world, he means Europe. And what he's saying here is, so you get the little states, build a standing army, make a stronger executive, which takes away power from the legislature and therefore the people. They invade the bigger states. The bigger states then follow suit and take more power from their legislative branches to the executive, and eventually we're going to start seeing what looks a lot like monarchies breaking out, and just like in Europe in times past, pretty constant warfare. This, at least, would be the natural course of things, and our reasonings will be the more likely to be just in proportion as they are accommodated to this standard. So it seems reasonable to me. It's just gonna. This will be the standard. There's not much more Alexander Hamilton, can say about it. All right, we got a one-sentence paragraph here. These are not vague inferences drawn from supposed or speculative defects in a constitution, the whole power of which is lodged in the hands of a people, or their representatives and delegates, but they are solid conclusions drawn from the natural and necessary progress of human affairs. It's easy for me to get out. So I'm not just saying this as random. I'm not making this up because I'm picking out little things in the Constitution. This is what happens. This is what has always happened, and this is what pretty obviously will happen should the states disunionize and become their own separate nations, which once again, I will remind you, no one was calling for. Hamilton's just using it as an example and trying to, while setting the groundwork for the overall argument of the Federalist Papers, putting a distaste in the common people's undecided voters' mouths for the Anti-Federalists. It may, perhaps, be asked, by way of objection to this, why did not standing armies spring up out of the contentions which so often distracted the ancient republics of Greece? So he's referencing now to history. Ancient Greece, of course, was a bunch of city-states, very small nations, kind of united under the idea of Greece, but generally separate entities. And people might ask, why didn't they have standing armies in Greece? Why didn't that happen? Different answers, equally satisfactory, may be given to this question. So I have a bunch of answers to that. Thank you for asking me. Hamilton likes to ask himself questions. The industrious habits of the people of the present day, absorbed in the pursuit of gain and devoted to the improvements of agriculture and commerce, are incompatible with the condition of a nation of soldiers, which was the true condition of the people of those republics. So what he's saying is the people of ancient Greece were soldiers. They were all soldiers. Now, this is true in certain places, famously Sparta, several of the other Greek republics, which I've not put nearly the research into ancient Greece that I have into the American Revolution, just to be clear. That being said, he's saying that the people of his contemporary United States were more focused on agriculture and commerce. So Americans wanted to make money. And that drive to improve, to have more to sell, to have better trade routes, the mercantilism that was driving the world for the previous 200 years and arguably still drives the world today, the people of ancient Greece were not conditioned to think that same way. They would prefer just to be soldiers and live in their little estates. Let's see if he continues on that. All right, pretty long sentence here. The means of revenue, which have been so greatly multiplied by the increase of gold and silver and of the arts of industry, and the science of finance, which is the offspring of modern times, concurring with the habits of nations, have produced an entire revolution in the system of war, and have rendered disciplined armies distinct from the body of the citizens, inseparable companions of frequent hostility. So, it's a lot to unpack in this sentence. The means of revenue which have been so greatly multiplied. So we have so much more gold and silver now, and we're so much better at industry. We're so much more industrious than we were. Additionally, we've learned so much about the science of finance, which becomes Hamilton's thing. He loves the science of finance, which is the offspring of modern times. So people at the time Hamilton was alive are so, as I was saying before, so eager to get ahead and make money and be prosperous and build both their wealth and the wealth of nations. It's a new thing that people in ancient Greece didn't necessarily have. Concurring with the habit of nations, so people and nations are both doing this, have produced an entire revolution in the system of war, which is interesting because I'll remind you, this is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. 6 months before this, at the week before the Constitutional Convention, one of Hamilton's friends and co-workers, Tench Coxe, gave a speech to the delegates of Pennsylvania and Virginia discussing manufacture, and he actually mentions very specifically steam power. So just to put some perspective on what's happening as the Constitution is being written and these debates are being had, they are talking about steam powered boats and mines and things of that nature. So he calls an entire revolution in the system of war, but and this is probably on accident, he's alluding to the Industrial Revolution, the arts of industry, the science of finance, modern times, the habits of nation, an entire revolution. Now again, he references it as system of war with the disciplined armies, which is true. But if it's almost like he's hitting on something and he doesn't even realize it at this point. So there will be, because of all that, there will be frequent hostility because of economic jealousies that ancient Greece simply didn't have. Hamilton continues, there is a wide difference also between military establishments in a country seldom exposed by its situation to internal invasions, and in one which is often subject to them and always apprehensive of them. So a difference between military status in a country that is seldom, so a nation that does have not necessarily violence, but revolutions rising from within, and nations I'm getting all twisted around on this one. There is a difference between nations that have internal problems and don't have internal problems, essentially. The rulers of the former can have a good pretext, if they are ever so inclined, to keep on foot armies so numerous as must of necessity be maintained in the latter. So, if one neighbor has internal problems, they will need to have a standing army there to police their people. And therefore, the neighbor that doesn't necessarily need that army will need it to make sure the first neighbor doesn't invade them with the big old army they got. Again, Hamilton is assuming the states have deunionized and are definitely going to war in this particular paper. These armies being, in the first case, rarely, if at all, called into activity for interior defense. The people are in no danger of being broken into military subordination. So if the latter nations, the one that don't really need the army, they're not really in danger of the army being called in. These nations being, at first case, rarely, if at all, called to activity for interior defense. Okay, so the latter nations shouldn't be so afraid of the standing army because it's only getting called in to defend for exterior reasons. So the ones that, basically, he's repeating himself. The nations that need a standing army to suppress the people are going to suppress the people. The nations that need a standing army just to fight off their neighbors that are suppressing their people probably won't use the army for negative reasons, which is an interesting turn in this paper, not really where he's been going this whole time. The laws are not accustomed to relaxations in favor of military exigencies. The civil state remains in full vigor, neither corrupted nor confounded with the principles or propensities of the other states. Okay, so that's what he was saying before, essentially. Because if you only have a standing army because your neighbor has one and they're using it to suppress their people, you don't have the laws on the books to suppress the people. And the army is not corrupted and has not been built for the purpose of suppressing the people, as opposed to that first nation that has a standing army specifically for that purpose. Whew, it's a really twisted one, Hamilton. All right, long one, we're going to have to break it down. The smallness of the army renders the natural strength of the community an overmatch for it, and the citizens, not habituated to look up to the military power for protection or to submit to its oppressions, neither love nor fear the soldiery. They view them with a spirit of jealous acquiescence and a necessary evil, and stand ready to resist a power which they suppose might be exerted to the prejudice of their rights. So, a nation that only has a standing army to defend from other standing armies is not scared of the standing army, nor are they worried, nor do they love it. They're just there, and it's just part of what's happening. But they are cautious. You should be cautious of the standing army in case it turns on you, but those laws aren't in the books, and that is not its purpose. Its purpose is there to defend from angry neighbors. This is a really interesting turn he's taken. After this sentence, I'll reflect on it a little bit. The army under such circumstances may usefully aid the magistrate to suppress a small faction, or an occasional mob or insurrection, but it will be unable to enforce encroachments against the united efforts of a great body of the people. I'm going to break that paragraph down. Let's say, let's use the New York, New Jersey example. Let's say New York has a big standing army because it wants its people to follow the rules. And New York gets a big standing army and has all these rules on the book that the army's allowed to suppress the people because it's doing bad things. And it wants the people to follow the rules. New Jersey will also have to build a pretty substantial standing army in case New York takes its standing army and turns it away from its own people and at New Jersey. New Jersey has to be ready for that. But in this example, New Jersey, its standing army is there really just to protect from New York. And it doesn't have rules on the books to suppress the people themselves. Therefore, the people of New Jersey in this scenario shouldn't be scared of the standing army. They shouldn't love the standing army and be in awe of it, but they shouldn't be afraid of it either. It's just there in case they need it. Now, because they're aware of the situation, should laws start to change and that standing army suppress the people of New Jersey, well, the great body of the people of New Jersey should be ready for that as active citizens and make sure it never happens. And that is, in essence, there's more here, but that's in essence Hamilton's argument for the standing army in the Constitution. We should have it, we shouldn't love it, we shouldn't hate it, it should just be here in case someone attacks us. But if something happens and the army starts turning against us, well, people should be ready for it and we should be able to control it. Now, can make arguments either way about whether or not that's possible. I will note the Anti-Federalist very much don't think that's how it would work in many of the Anti-Federalist papers being written at this time. Where does he go from here? In a country in the predicament last described, the contrary of all this happens. So, in our New Jersey, as our example, the contrary of that would happen. Interesting. Where's he going with it? Let's see where he goes with this. That's a short sentence. I'm not going to say too much on it. The perpetual menacings of danger oblige the government to be always prepared to repel it. Its armies must be numerous enough for instant defense. The perpetual menacing dangers oblige the government always prepare to repel it. So you need the army, as we said, New Jersey needs its army to be ready in case New York freaks out at any time. The continual necessity for their services enhances the importance of the soldier and proportionally degrades the condition of the citizen. Hold on, let's make sure we know which one is the last described. Useful made a small faction or an occasional mob, but it will be unable to enforce encroachments against the united efforts of the people. So we're talking about the New Jersey in our example. The perpetual menacings of the danger oblige the government will always be prepared to repel it. Its armies must be numerous enough for defense. Right, so New Jersey must have a good enough army for defense. But the continual necessity of an army of this nature means that the importance of the soldier will always become more important, while the citizens will always be more and more at risk of being subordinated, even in the New Jersey example of the standing army. The military state becomes elevated above the civil. Okay, so interesting turn. So even this New Jersey example, even though the New Jersey standing army was built just to repel the New York standing army, it's going to wear away the rights of the individual as the military becomes more important. The inhabitants of territories, often the theater of war, are unavoidably subject to frequent infringements on their rights, which serve to weaken their sense of those rights, and by degrees, the people are brought to consider the soldiery not only as their protectors, but their superiors. So fighting is often in territories, so not necessarily like the cities. It's usually on the fringes of nations where ownership is questionable. unavoidably the subject of infringements on the rights. So the people living in those territories have their rights infringed on, because when you're in the middle of a war zone, well, your rights get infringed on. That's kind of the part of war that is unavoidable. And the people there, as their rights are infringed on, they by degrees find the soldiers that are on their side not only there to protect and help them, but actually as their superiors. So the soldiers are not just there to help. The soldiers are in charge, and we have to do what the soldiers say. Right? The transition from this disposition to that of considering them masters is neither remote nor difficult, but it is very difficult to prevail upon a people under such impressions to make a bold or effectual resistance to usurpations supported by the military power. So it's not hard to see why the people would find the soldiers that are protecting them, put them on a pedestal, and think they're more important. It's happened throughout history. But what's really difficult would to convince those people, once they're under this impression, to say, okay, maybe we don't need the soldiers in charge. Maybe we can take the power back. Take a quick sip of water. Is he going to give us a history lesson? The Kingdom of Great Britain falls within the first description. An insular situation and a powerful marine, guarding it in a great measure against the possibility of foreign invasion, supersede the necessity of a numerous army within the kingdom. So since Great Britain is an island, they have the navy out there, not letting any invasions come in. They don't really need a standing army in Great Britain. On the Isles of Wales, England, Scotland, Ireland, they didn't need a standing army there because no one was invading, because they had such a great navy. A sufficient force to make head against a sudden descent, till the militia could have time to rally and embody, is all that has ever been deemed requisite. So, if someone was to invade, they got past the might of the British Navy, well, the people who make up the militia could get together and win. No motive of national policy is demanded, nor would public opinion have tolerated a large number of troops upon its domestic establishment. So, Great Britain doesn't need it, and the people wouldn't let it happen anyway to form a standing army. There has been, for a long time past, little room for the operation of the other causes, which have been enumerated as the consequences of internal war. So, the other things I said that could happen from an internal war, hasn't happened because Britain doesn't have a lot of wars on its own shores. The particular felicity of situation has, in great degree, contributed to preserve the liberty which that country to this day enjoys, in spite of the prevalent venality and corruption. So even though Great Britain's super corrupt and terrible people are running it, the people were able to preserve their liberty because there's no need for a standing army. If, on the contrary, Britain had been situated on the continent, Europe, and had been compelled, as she would have been, by that situation, to make her military establishments at home coextensive with those of the other great powers of Europe, she, like them, would in turn, in all probability at this day, a victim to the absolute power of a single man. So if Britain was in continental Europe, it would have needed a standing army because it couldn't just use the navy to make sure no one invaded. Therefore, they would become much more reliant on one king, and it would be much more war-torn like those of Europe. 'Tis possible, though not easy, that the people of that island may be enslaved from other causes. But it cannot be by the prowess of an army so inconsiderable as that which had been usually kept within the kingdom. So, yes, the people of Great Britain could easily be enslaved, but not by the army, because it's just not big enough to enslave everyone. If we are wise enough to preserve the Union, we may for ages enjoy an advantage similar to that of an insulated situation. Europe is at great distance from us. Okay, so I skipped that first sentence. If we sign on to the Constitution for a very long time, we could be like Europe and just worry about not letting anyone sail to our shores as opposed to going to war amongst each other. Europe's far away. Her colonies in our vicinity will be likely to continue too much disproportioned in strength to be able to give us any dangerous annoyance. So Europe's colonies over here, they're too far away from their monarchs to actually give us real trouble. I mean, that's questionable. Spain was pretty powerful down in Mexico at the time. Extensive military establishments cannot, in this position, be necessary to our security. So, if we were to fall into this situation, extensive military establishments, as I said before, just what we today would call the military-industrial complex, it wouldn't be necessary. We just need our navy to keep people off our shores. We should be all right. Although I know he does, in later papers, go into the Native Americans and things of that nature when he's verifying why we need a standing army. Okay, we'll get there. But if we should be disunited, and the integral parts should either remain separated or, which is most probable, should be thrown together into 2 or 3 confederacies, we should be, in a short course of time, in the predicament of the continental powers of Europe. Our liberties would be prey to the means of defending ourselves against the ambition and jealousies of each other. At the beginning there, the first half of this is him, again, he's bringing up this idea of being disunited or in separate confederacies. So basically, should we not sign on to the Constitution, we're going to go to war with each other because we'll be jealous of each other, and then Europe's going to sail across the sea and just take over. Oh, great. Not ideal. This is an idea not superficial or futile, but solid and weighty. They used to use the word weighty a lot. I really like that. I wish we'd bring back the word weighty. But basically saying this, I'm not just saying this. This is for real. It deserves the most serious and mature consideration of every prudent and honest man of whatever party. Excuse me. Which is true. Everyone should look at this, take it seriously. You might disagree, but you should definitely take it seriously. If such men will make a firm and solemn pause, and meditate dispassionately on the importance of this interesting idea, if they will contemplate it in all its attitudes and trace it to all its consequences, they will not hesitate to part with trivial objections to a constitution, the rejection of which would in all probability put a final period on the Union. So I'm going to go to that last part there. He's saying at the end there, if you reject the Constitution, then we're all going to dissolve, no more government, which isn't true. The Articles of Confederation would still be there, and most Anti-Federalists would still have wanted to improve them. But at the end, he's saying, if you don't do the Constitution, we're going to get invaded by Europe. That's it. That's you. But he does say here, we need to meditate dispassionately, really think about what's going on. Okay. He's basically saying it's all going to come crashing down. Anyway. The airy phantoms that flit before the distempered imaginations of some of its adversaries would quickly give place to the more substantial forms of dangers, real, certain, and formidable. So this last sentence here, the airy phantoms that flit. I don't know what flit. I guess flitter. Before that, or flew. Is that old timey for have flown? Basically. He's saying some of the people who don't like the Constitution are saying all these things, but they are ignoring dangers, real, certain, and formidable. So real dangers that could really hurt us. Publius. There it is. Publius. And we did read the footnote a little earlier, saying how he's going to go into how the standing army would work in a later Federalist paper. And that is it. Now, just to sum up this Federalist number 8 we just finished, Hamilton basically, for the most part, is saying if we don't have the Constitution, then we're going to fall apart. The Articles of Confederation just aren't going to work. Again, that's not necessarily true. Even the Anti-Federalists wanted to keep the Articles of Confederation and, for the most part, improve on them. They just didn't necessarily want a national government. Hamilton then brings up the example that if we have what would happen is because of the modern nations we live in, there would be jealousies between the states if they weren't united. And this one state, we use the examples of New York and New Jersey in this discussion, even though he doesn't, I did. In summary, he said, if New York builds a standing army and uses that standing army to suppress its people, New Jersey's going to also need to build a standing army to protect itself in case New York turns its standing army away from its own people on New Jersey. And therefore, New Jersey is going to have a standing army which will slowly but surely eat away at the rights of the people, especially once wars start with New York, which will inevitably happen. And the people, most notably in the war-torn territories, are going to see the soldiers there not just as people protecting them, but as people who are above them in station. And it's a very dangerous situation. Now, Europe never had, or he says very specifically, Great Britain never had this problem because they had a navy keeping people off their shores. So Great Britain never really needed a standing army because they weren't worried about invasion. They instead had a small enough army where, say, the British Army did turn on the people of Great Britain, they would be repulsed by the local militias and local people because they just don't have the numbers. However, on the continent of Europe, you see the opposite thing, where one person gets very powerful and has complete control of the people through the army. And while Hamilton doesn't get too deep into the Navy and how it would work, and he does kind of brush off the other colonies, like French Canada, no big deal, and New Spain, no, they're not going to be powerful because their monarchs are overseas. He does kind of brush that off pretty cavalierly, although Spain was pretty, New Spain was pretty powerful. I'm kind of surprised he brushes it off so easily. But again, as always, Federalist Papers are propaganda. They're trying to get people to come over and sign and vote for the Constitution. Interestingly enough, more or less what he's alluding to is if we unite under the Constitution, and he will get into this in future papers, if we unite under the Constitution, we'll be able to keep other nations, specifically of Europe, off our shores, and we won't have to worry about war coming to us. That's essentially the outline of this particular paper. So, bring myself, nope, wrong button. There I am, bring myself back up. Thank you guys for coming. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, I am always here. Alex did say, I love how, I'm sorry, Cookie said, I love how Alex, or my nickname for Hammy, writes giant paragraph sentences. Yes, so did John Jay actually like the one paragraph sentence more, I've noticed, than Alexander Hamilton. I like to call him Ali Hams a lot, but that's just me. Thank you guys for coming. I really appreciate it. As I said, any questions, find me in the description, email, social media, wherever. I'm available to you. We also have a Discord channel, which if you'd like to join that, it's a lot of fun. I am doing these several nights a week now. I'm hoping to get through them in like 6 months because there's 85 of them. And if I do one a night, 3 nights a week, that's still about 6 months from now. So we'll see. Thank you guys again. And I'll be back with another founder for you tomorrow.